Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. So, welcome back to our series of lectures on human rights and media tracking. This afternoon, we are going to deal with a lecture entitled Development Journalism from National and International Perspectives. So, we are going to be introduced, of course, to development journalism. What does it mean, development journalism? What is it about, this concept? And at the same time, we are going to study some very important example of this journalism. We're going to see the types of development journalism, and at the same time the role of development journalists and the challenges, of course, that development journalism, of course, faces. So I do believe that development journalism is very crucial, especially when we talk about the issue of human rights and the issue of sustainability, the issue of development. So what we can say, for example, about development journalism is that it was, of course, launched by the Press Foundation of Asia in the 1960s. And this foundation, the Press Foundation of Asia, of course, it launched this development journalism in order to think and to rethink the subjects, of course, of economic development, social development, cultural development from inside and not from outside. So this kind of journalism, it focuses on issues of social change, economic progress, political development, and of course the improvement of people's quality of life. Unlike, for example, mainstream journalism, so this development journalism emphasizes like conflict, immediate events, and at the same time it prioritizes the long-term issues that shape society, such as poverty, health, education, gender. So unlike mainstream journalism, or what we call, as we are going to see, traditional journalism, this kind of journalism is very important, especially while fostering and boosting human rights and economic and social, cultural development. So therefore, we opt for these objectives in order to handle our lectures. So the first one is to define the concept of development journalism and explain its importance in addressing societal issues. So these are the things that we are going to investigate in this lecture. The second objective is to explore the role of development journalism in fostering social change and promoting sustainable development. The third objective is to examine key principles of develop and approaches of development journalism, including how it differs from traditional forms of journalism or from mainstream journalism. The last one is about to analyze case studies. So we are going to see examples of development journalism and real world, of course, instances of development journalism in practice. So these are the objectives of our lecture today. So I hope that we are going to manage and reach these objectives, because we do believe that development journalism also plays a very important role in boosting and in protecting human rights at the same time, but not just human rights. But as I have said, it's not just about economic growth or economic development, but development journalism, it's also about tracing and fostering social, cultural development. So as you see here, development journalism is in opposition to traditional journalism. If traditional, for example, as we all know, traditional journalism is just about maybe tracing a fact, reporting on some events, for example, some trends in our societies, and sometimes with subjectivity, sometimes with objectivity. So, but it's not a sort of journalism which is participatory. It is just a journalism of just reporting the event. reporting on factual, on facts, events, trends, and that's it. And it stops here. It stops in just narrating stories, okay, as we may say. But development journalism, it's something else. Development journalism is a kind of journalism that, of course, that plays a very crucial role in our society. Why? Because it is like a partner to the government of the society. It is a contributor, okay, to the society's development, either economic development or cultural or social or even political. So when, for example, development journalism, when it traces an event, it doesn't just trace the event, but it provides us with some solutions, with some suggestions, not just tracing the event and we stop here, unlike, for example, traditional journalism. But it adds something, it participates in the economic, social growth, and sometimes even it propounds many solutions to many problems. So it doesn't just tell stories about problems, it doesn't just witness problems and stops here. No, but it helps the government, it can even work with the non-government organizations, for example. It can work with civil associations, like with the human rights associations, for example, as we are going to see many examples or case studies later on, okay, to just concretize what I am saying now. So this is what concerns development journalism. There is another issue which is very important in development journalism. You should know that this type of journalism was initiated in the third world countries. And this sort of development journalism played a very pivotal role in the colonial era. And it is also very, nowadays it is very prospering in the third world countries. And in Philippines, for example, when they launched the foundation, the Press Foundation of Asia in the 1960s. So they have emphasized the question that this development journalism should be from inside, not from outside, and should be very different from the Western model of journalism. Why? Because it should be very concerned about our local contextual issues. Okay, so this is something when we talk about development journalism. So it is something that was initiated in the third world countries and in the former colonies. And it asserts also the principle that when the principle of narrating or of shedding light on events, for example, or any activities, but from the local perspective, taking into consideration the cultural context, the economic context, the political context. So this is something which is very important in development journalism. Of course, it is not just in opposition with traditional journalism, but it is in opposition with Western journalism. So this is something that we can call it even indigenous development journalism. It is a journalism that was born inside our countries, inside the third world countries, and not inside the West. So this is something that belongs to the third world countries, and it is very, of course, it plays a very crucial role. Well, so we will see again what do we mean exactly by development journalism. So what is development journalism in the first instance? So it's about highlighting underrepresented voices. It's about promoting sustainable development. It's about fostering public participation. It's about advocating for social change. So you see, this is grosso modo what do you mean by development journalism. But you should pay attention to the thing that I have emphasized, that this is a sort of development journalism that is from inside. that was born in the third world countries, okay, and that of course that is in opposition to the Western model of journalism. This is something local, and we have it in many African, Asian, of course, countries. Why? Because it helps to promoting the economy and also the political, the cultural spheres. Well, so what we can say, for example, here, like advocating for social change. So it aims here to, it uses many platforms. So this is development journalism. So it uses many platforms to inform the public about the steps needed to improve their living. So it advocates for social change, and this is something which is very important. And it even suggests, as I have said, solutions to problems. Whenever there is a problem, unlike traditional journalism, whenever there is a problem, so development journalism, it reports on the problem, but at the same time it propounds, it suggests, for example, some solutions and some suggestions. Highlighting underrepresented voices. This is something very important. When we talk about development journalism, it's the journalism of marginalized people. It's the journalism of the vulnerable segments of our society, like women, like children, for example, like ethnic minorities. Okay, so those people, for example, they have a very central focus in while in development journalism. So underrepresented, you see, and highlighting underrepresented voices, highlighting, for example, and questioning people, for example, or giving even voice to people who are silenced, either silenced under political oppression, for example, or they are silenced because they belong to ethnic minorities, or because or because just because of their gender or their race or their color skin. So this development journalism so helps, of course, to highlighting underrepresented voices, and even not just highlighting, but even suggesting and propounding solutions to give voice to those people and integrate them into the society. So this is like an inclusive, again, goal that this development journalism, of course, helps us to attain it and reach it. There is also promoting sustainable development. This is something very important. So this kind of journalism contributes to sustainable practices by reporting, for example, like the lecture that we had this morning. So to report on what? On environmental concerns, for example, to report on poverty alleviation, to report on social justice, to report on human rights, for example. So these are noble aims and noble goals of this development journalism. So you see, it's unlike mainstream journalism or what we call traditional journalism. Fostering public participation. This is also something which is very important. How it fosters public participation? By encouraging citizens to engage in democratic processes. You see, so when we can describe this development journalism as being, or as being descriptive, but at the same time prescriptive. So this is maybe the main definition that you can note down, that this development journalism, it is descriptive because it describes, it narrates, it depicts, it portrays events, problems, for example, or what's happening on in our society, in our politics, in our economy, in our area, for example, in our environment also. But at the same time, it doesn't stop here. It doesn't stop in just describing, but it extends, okay, its role to what? To prescribing. It means suggesting solutions, suggesting, for example, many resolutions to serious problems, like the problem of immigration, for example, illegal immigration. So this is what we mean here by fostering public participation. sometimes even by providing information that influences policy decisions. Why not? Like, for example, elections, like community involvement. So you see how this kind of development journalism, it is both descriptive and prescriptive. I will refer you to Angela Romano. So she is one of the most important scholars of this development journalism, and she has indeed, of course, written and published many books on development journalism and on deliberative journalism also. So according to her, development journalism involves creating journalism that helps societies improve their standard of living, particularly in post-colonial developing nations. So we should underline, particularly in post-colonial developing nations. So I have already explained to you that this development journalism was the baby. Let's say it's the baby of the third world countries. Why? Because the third world countries opted for this kind of development journalism in order to think, in order to describe their own problems in context. And at the same time, even when they prescribe solutions, so they prescribe solutions in context also, taking into consideration, of course, their difference from Western societies. So this is what characterizes mostly development journalism. We're going to see, of course, the role of development journalism. So, of course, it plays a very important role in our society. It works. It's like we can call it a partner, a very like legitimate partner of our government. Okay, so unlike, for example, biased journalism or stereotypical journalism or mainstream journalism, so this journalism is an intellectual. It is an intellectual sort of journalism. So the role of development journalism is policy advocacy, grassroots empowerment, sustainable development goals. So what do you mean by advocating or policy, for example, policy advocacy? So policy advocacy sometimes, for example, wherever there is a change in society, there is a reform, for example. So this development journalism, it helps politicians, for example, maybe during even the period of elections. So it helps the politicians. It goes or it suggests, for example, like the strategies of reform, strategies of building organizations, associations. So it is a kind of policy advocacy. Grassroots empowerment also. This development journalism, it does something which is very, very important, which is empowering marginalized people and empowering people who are very weak in our societies, or people, for example, who are illiterate. And something that is very important that you should know here is that development journalism is not a sort of journalism that is devoted to the elite only. No, it's not to the elite, but it's to the whole population. Especially, it's a sort of journalism that helps the population, for example, to voice their plight, to voice their problems, and to voice, for example, all their conditions, their social conditions, for example, their economic conditions and cultural conditions, environmental conditions also. Also, it helps it has a role in sustainable development. Why? Because development journalism also, it has a say in environmental issues. And it works sometimes even with environmental, like non-government organizations. There are other rules. Okay, so the principle, so of course, this development journalism, in addition to the rules, for example, and in addition to the important place of this sort of journalism, it has also some principles like human development focus, like fact-based solution-oriented reporting, like local indigenous context, ethical, it's a sort of ethical, of course, journalism. So you see, of course, development journalism, it works within some principles. And those principles, the first one is human development focus. It contributes to the development of our countries, and not just contributing, but it suggests reforms, it suggests strategies, and so many things in order to boost, of course, either the development, for example, of human rights. So you will find many journalists or development journalists, so they advocate for human rights. Fact-based and solution-oriented reporting. While development journalists, for example, when they report on some incidents in our societies or some reports, so of course that's good because they describe the event, but at the same time they prescribe. It's fact based, this is good, but solution oriented, not just describing the fact, but they suggest also solutions. They are like politicians, okay, but they don't have that force of the law, but they just suggest to politicians, for example, what they should do, for example, in that particular situation, because journalists sometimes they can reach the population more than politicians, for example, and sometimes they can travel, they can maybe go to small villages in order to report, so they know the population sometimes, and they are familiar with what's going on in their societies, especially that they focus on something which is very important, which is the local indigenous context. As I have emphasized before, and this is something that you should bear in your mind, is that this sort of development journalism, and you should pay attention to this because this is very important. It is an indigenous sort of journalism. As I have said, it is a sort of journalism that is coming from inside, not from outside. It's a sort of journalism that takes into consideration the indigenous context, the local context, the particularities of our communities, the particularities, for example, of our villages, of our small cities. Why? Because we do believe, for example, that something maybe that there is difference all over the world. That this is something that we all witness. There are many differences, many discrepancies, okay, all over the world, and each country is totally different. From another. Therefore, so this indigenous, this sort of development journalism, so it takes into consideration the indigenous context. Ethical journalism. This is something very important, and I think there will be a lecture about ethical journalism or ethical media later on, maybe tomorrow or after. Ethical journalism, this development journalism takes into consideration, because sometimes when you report on poverty, for example, when you report on poor people, when you report, for example, on the most vulnerable people like kids, when you report on people, for example, on people who are vulnerable to violence, for example, or when you report on human rights violations or human rights, for example, transgression. Here you should pay attention to this development journalism pays attention to something which is very important. It's the ethic of reporting, because sometimes it's good to report that yes, there is poverty, but you shouldn't humiliate people. You should report, but remember that the most important right that we talked about before is the right to dignity, and all the declarations, the international treaties, the institutional frameworks that we have seen before, so they have stemmed from one single thing, which is asserting and confirming human dignity. So sometimes it's very nice to and it's a duty to report on poverty, but you should of course report, but at the same time taking some distance, and in order not to humiliate those poor people, and in order not to show them, for example, to show them to the public in a very miserable way, in a very bad way. So this is something that will humiliate them. So we should take into consideration this ethical issue, while, and this is one of the major principles of development journalism, is that it takes into consideration these ethical issues while reporting, especially on marginalized voices in our society, especially when those development journalists, they report on like poverty, inequality, like health, climate change, also environmental issues, and so on and so forth. So they take into consideration this question of ethical journalism. Now we will see the role of development journalists. So they are nation builders, and by the way, this is also taken from Angela Romano, of course, book Development Journalism. I'm going to show you the reference later on. So the development journalists, they are nation builders. They build society. Okay, so this is a very noble role of those journalists, because they don't just, as I have said, describe the event or narrate stories to us. It's not about narrating stories, or it's not about reporting or transmitting to us fake news. No, but they build society through detecting our problems and through suggesting very relevant solutions. They are also government partners. So those development journalists, they are government partners. Why? Because they know what's going on in our societies. They know the things, for example, that people suffer from. So therefore, they are partner to government. They help. Sometimes they help politicians. They help government members. Okay, to just attain their aims and work for the benefits of their countries. They are also guardians, they are watchdogs. Okay, this is also something which is very important. Wherever there is, for example, an incident in a country, so those countries, they are guardians of what? Of democracy. Sometimes even they measure to what extent democracy is taking place or not, to what extent this democracy is practiced or is put into action or not. And this is why, what do you mean by guardians? Okay, so because this development, of course, journalism also, it has a purpose, okay, behind the reporting, for example, objectively, or behind even prescribing solutions. So the major aim is to set up a very democratic society where everyone, for example, enjoys equality and sustainable space. Well, they are also agents of empowerment. And this is also something which is very important. They are agents of empowerment. Why? Because they help empowering marginalized people. They empower, for example, like people with disabilities, for example. So they play like a very psychological, let's say a psychological role. So they empower marginalized people without voice, for example, like people belonging to ethnic minorities, ethnic groups, for example. So they are agents of empowerment. Now let's see now the types of this journalism. So of course we have talked about the principles, the definition of development journalism, and we have talked about the role of the development journalist, okay, himself or herself. And now we come to the types of course journalism. So as you see, there are like a lot of or a lot of types. So you see advocacy journalism, solution journalism, human rights journalism, environmental journalism, participatory journalism. We're going to see development news, the journalism, also public service journalism, investigative journalism. So a lot of types, but of course each type has a mission. Let's begin with advocacy journalism. Advocacy journalism is about raising awareness advocating for social, political, economic change on behalf of marginalized groups. It is often used to highlight issues, but for example, poverty, human rights, and environmental sustainability. So you see, this is what we mean by advocacy journalism, and it has a very important aim, is that it influences public opinion, it informs policy, it mobilizes resources for specific causes or social movements. So this is what we mean by advocacy journalism, like for example reporting on campaigns for gender equality, reporting on child labor eradication, for example, reporting on indigenous rights of indigenous peoples. So you see, so this is really a very noble mission of those development journalists. There is also solution journalism, as you see here. It's about also finding, like, suggesting solutions. Sometimes, as I have said, you may face like a problem, or sorry. Yes, okay, solution journalism. So sometimes there are many problems that our societies, for example, suffer from. But of course, thanks to this sort of journalism, so sometimes, even as I have said before, they can even find solutions. Then there is this type of human rights journalism. So I think that's last lecture, maybe before yesterday, when we deal with media tracking. So we have been introduced that journalism, or even media in general, has a very intertwined relationship with human rights, and this is of course what we mean by human rights journalism. This sort of journalism, it detects human rights violations. It detects, for example, women's rights violations. It detects sometimes even children's rights transgression. So this is what we mean by human rights journalism. Environmental journalism. So we have been talking this morning about environmental sustainability, and we have talked about the question of the environment and how we should keep our earth clean and relevant to our life. So this sort of journalism, as we are going to see in the examples, so of course it deals with environmental issues, for example, with climate change, for example, with water pollution, with the greenhouse gas, for example. Sometimes even it suggests solutions like the solar energies projects, and this is also a very important sort of journalism. There is also participatory journalism, and this is something very important that I have, of course, emphasized from the very beginning. So participatory journalism, it means that, or it emphasizes the involvement of local communities. Okay, so it is with the community all the time. So it involves, it emphasizes the active involvement of local communities in the reporting process, and it involves people from marginalized or underserved communities to contribute to news production and sharing their own stories, sharing their issues, their concerns. This is something which is very important in participatory journalism. As I have emphasized before, that this type of participatory journalism, it's it's against just fostering the elite. It's against the elite, but it is participatory in the fact that it gives voice to local populations, not just the elite. Okay, so it's not a sort of journalism, it's not for the elite. It ensures, and it lays bare their own perspectives. It shows their own stories, okay, people's stories, and this is something very important. For example, there is a community-based media project sometimes where local residents report on issues affecting their neighborhoods. This is a sort of development journalism, like access to clean water, for example. So here it deals with environmental issues like local education reform. Sometimes even in our universities we find this sort of participatory journalism even among students. It's very small, but of course it has a purpose. Why? Because it depicts the problems of students. Like for example, at Qadi Ayad University we have just launched the university channel, and that university channel, it's a sort, and we are going now to work on even journalistic articles, and that channel has a purpose of following students activities, students problems, and we broadcast of course those activities, and everyone at the university so has access to that, and it is a very successful experience in which students can voice all their activities, and as well as all their problems, and this is something which is really very very successful. Well, so let's continue. Another type of development journalism. So you have development news journalism, public service journalism, investigative journalism. So what do you mean by development news journalism? So this is about, it focuses on the ongoing coverage of development issues like economic growth, education, healthcare, infrastructure, for example, governance in developing nations. So these are the major concerns of this sort of development journalism, especially development news journalism. And its very aim is that to keep the public informed about national concerns, about national development plans, national development reforms, governmental progress, for example, national development strategies, organizations, and at the same time, it keep the public informed about the impact of various development programs and policies, and this is a sort of development news journalism. There is also public service journalism. It is designed to serve the public interests by providing information that helps, of course, improve the quality of life. It often focuses on educational programs, university curriculum, for example, public health, emergency health sometimes. So this is public service journalism. So sometimes it even informs citizens about their rights, responsibilities, their right to environment, their right to health, and so on and so forth, and it provides the government, of course, of those reports, and at the same time with suggestions and proposals. Investigative journalism, this is also a sort of journalism that is within the umbrella concept of development journalism. It is investigative in the sense that it seeks to uncover corruption. It seeks to uncover social injustice. It seeks to uncover sometimes systemic issues that hinder the development. So this sort of developed of journalism, for example, it digs deep into our social, political, and economic mismanagement and human rights abuse, human rights violations. This is also something or some. These are also noble goals, okay, that this development journalism takes into consideration. Sometimes even like investigating the misuse of foreign aid, for example, reporting on environmental degradation, sometimes even reporting on corruption. So these are the rules, of course, of this development, or this very particular investigative journalism. So you see that grosso modo this sort of development journalism, it does matter in our societies, and we should, of course, like we should endorse, okay, this sort of development journalism, because it works hand in hand with our government, with our politicians, and of course it serves it has very noble goals and noble purposes. Why? Because it helps boosting and fostering economic, social, and cultural growth of our societies. Of course, this development journalism has many rules and has many principles and has many types. And we have talked about its noble role. That this is something very, very nice. But at the same time, it isn't all the time without challenges. So of course, this development journalism, unfortunately speaking, so it faces, of course, some challenges like political and governmental interference. So sometimes, of course, some, especially in dictator societies or authoritative societies, so sometimes those journalists, so they face many challenges, of course, in reporting the news as they should be. Commercial pressures also, so sometimes even advertisement and those commercial for example spheres, so they interfere in the work of this kind of journalism. Also, lack of resources. Sometimes it's very hard because this development journalism, of course, needs funding, needs financial aid, for example, to perform its role in a very good way. Also, ethical dilemma. So I have talked about this question, but it's this is really a very it's really a challenge, okay, because sometimes it's very hard. You face you find yourself in a really very serious dilemma that you can't solve, because you may just question whether shall I depict, for example, those poor people, shall I take pictures of them, or shall I just report without for example, reporting, or without taking pictures. So you see, this is ethical, or these are ethical dilemmas, because this is something which is very important. Sometimes you can, like this development journalism, sometimes those journalists, for example, they can report, because this is their duty, to report on poverty, for example, or to report on human rights abuse. This is their duty. But sometimes how is very important here. How they can report on those violations, for example, without falling in the trap of those ethical dilemmas, or without humiliating, for example, those people. So those are really many challenges that this kind of development journalism, of course, faces. Well, so grosso modo, what the thing of development journalism. So as I have said, it is very this kind of journalism. It's very disseminated in Asia, but it has now it is spread all over the world, and especially in Africa, for example. So I'm going to give you some. Even in India, you have development journalism that, of course, that is concerned with so many issues like healthcare, for example. And I think that in Asia, this kind of development journalism is very developed and is very progressed. But anyway, so I'm going to shed more light on this development journalism by providing you some concrete examples. So this is an example, the Green Belt movement, and here development journalism intervenes. This movement is in Kenya, and it is founded by Wangari Maathai. It's a Nobel Peace Prize laureate. And this green belt has been instrumental in promoting environmental, of course, conservation and women's empowerment in Kenya. This is a very important foundation. And what's the role of journalists here, or development journalism? This of course, movement works hand in hand with development journalism. And journalists, for example, who have reported on this movement, so they have raised awareness about deforestation, for example, the importance of having a very clean, sustainable development practices. At the same time, they contribute to the campaign's success in reforestation, and at the same time in women's involvement in environmental advocacy. So you see, this is the role of development journalism. It's about raising awareness, it's about contributing in campaigns, it's about empowering women. So we have talked about that those development journalists, they are agents of empowerment. So this is how this association has been really disseminated, thanks to this kind of development journalism. There is also another, so this is in Kenya. There is also another example. This is Bolsa Familia, and this is also a program that happened to be or to exist in Brazil. And this program, what is the function of this program is that it provides financial assistance to low income families. Of course, this is also, and it here, what is the role of development journalism? Development journalists, of course, they have reported on the successes and challenges of the program. This is, you see how those development journalists work hand in hand and in collaboration, in cooperation with those movements and those organizations. So this Bolsa Familia also, this is a movement that has been, of course, highlighted thanks to development journalism. Why? Because this kind of journalism has helped those people, for example, and has helped the program at all. It has shown the challenges of the program, and it has also shown the successes of the program. This is something also very, very important. So these are just maybe two small examples about how development journalism works. And I think that in many countries all over the world, so as I have told you before, that this sort of development journalism is like the baby of third world countries. And it is a sort of journalism that of course comes from inside and not from the outside. It is a sort of journalism that takes into consideration the local context of indigenous people, the social particularities, the cultural particularities of countries, especially talking about third world countries that have, of course, previously experienced colonialism and imperialism. So against or in opposition to Western journalism, for example. So this kind of development journalism, it's a sort of indigenous. This is how I call it. Indeed, it's a sort of indigenous development journalism. So as a conclusion, so I would like to conclude by Mahatma Gandhi's quotation. So according to Mahatma Gandhi, he claims that I believe that a struggle which chiefly relies on internal strength cannot be wholly carried out without a newspaper. So you see, so here again, we find that the pivotal role of journalism, that it is very important. Sometimes you have many principles. Yes, you have a cause, and you have a reason. You have something. You have a goal, for example, in life. you have a noble mission in your society, but you have a struggle even in your society, but you cannot achieve it without seeking maybe refuge, let's call it like this, seeking refuge in development journalism, because this is something very important, and it is also emphasized by Mahatma Gandhi. So these are the references from which I have based my lecture. So these are very, very important. In addition to the book I told you by Angela Romano, so I can give you the link of the book, of course, later on, maybe tomorrow in the other lectures. Okay, so we end our lecture, and thank you very much.